You don't raise your voice. You don't demand. You don't make scenes. You notice tension before it forms. You sense shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, subtle withdrawals. And when something feels off, your instinct isn't to confront. It's to soften, to explain yourself, to give more, to shrink just enough to restore balance. And somehow, despite your kindness, because of it, you keep finding yourself disrespected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, casually, repeatedly. You tolerate interruptions. You excuse dismissiveness. You let boundaries blur just this once, and then again and again. You tell yourself it's not worth the conflict, that you're being mature, that you understand people, but late at night when the noise dies down, something inside you tightens. A question you don't want to ask. Why do I keep accepting this? Here is the paradox that defines your inner world. The very trait that once kept you safe, your kindness, is now the thing, eroding your dignity. You weren't born this way. You were shaped. Your kindness is not naive. It's strategic. It's precise. It's learned. And it came from a time when being good meant being acceptable, and being acceptable meant being safe. This video is not about blaming you for tolerating disrespect. It's about uncovering the invisible conditioning that taught you to confuse endurance with virtue and silence with strength. Because deeply kind people don't tolerate disrespect due to low self-worth. They do it because somewhere along the way, self-erasure was rewarded. To understand this pattern, we need to move beneath behavior and into adaptation. One of the core mechanisms at play here is fawn response, a lesser-discussed sibling of fight, flight, and freeze. Coined within trauma psychology, the fawn response describes a nervous system strategy where safety is achieved through appeasement. When confrontation feels dangerous, the body learns, if I am agreeable, I will survive. Closely tied to this is parentification, a childhood role reversal where a child learns to manage the emotional climate of adults. These children become experts in emotional labor before they ever learn self-protection. They learn to read moods, to anticipate needs, to smooth conflict before it explodes. But there's a cost. Over time, this conditioning wires the brain toward hypervigilance, a chronic state of scanning for emotional threat. The default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-referential thought, becomes oriented around others rather than the self. Your inner dialogue doesn't ask, "What do I need?" It asks, "What will keep this stable?" This is not empathy, it's survival empathy. Add to this an anxious attachment style, and the pattern deepens. Love becomes something that must be maintained through effort. Discomfort is interpreted as danger. Distance feels like abandonment. So disrespect isn't registered as a violation, it's registered as a test you feel responsible for passing. Kindness in this context is not softness. It's control. A way to prevent loss. A way to avoid rupture. A way to keep the nervous system regulated by keeping others comfortable. The tragedy is not that you give too much. The tragedy is that you disappear while doing it. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For deeply kind people, this terror isn't abstract, because self-acceptance risks rejection. And rejection early on felt catastrophic. So you learn to trade authenticity for belonging. You silence the impulse to speak up. You edit your reactions. You swallow resentment and call it understanding. Over time, this creates what can only be described as invisible grief. Grief for the self you never defended. Grief for the boundaries you never enforced. Grief for the truth you never spoke. You feel it when someone jokes at your expense and you smile. Someone crosses a line and you rationalize it. Someone takes without asking and you call it generosity. And the core fear beneath all of it is this: if I stop being kind, I will lose love. Not because it's true, but because it was once true enough to imprint. So life becomes complex, exhausting. Every interaction requires calculation. Should I say something? Is it worth it? Am I being too sensitive? This isn't peace. It's emotional taxation, and it accumulates. This conditioning doesn't disappear in adulthood. It disguises itself. You might notice it in at least 6 distinct ways. In relationships, you attract partners who take your patience for granted. You over-explain boundaries. You stay longer than you should because you believe leaving is a moral failure. At work, you accept unfair workloads. You avoid advocating for yourself. You become indispensable and invisible. With friends, you're the listener, the fixer, the reliable one. But when you need support, the room feels empty. Internally, you experience chronic guilt for resting, for saying no, for wanting more. Your inner critic speaks in the voice of responsibility. In conflict, you de-escalate even when you're right. You apologize for tone instead of addressing harm. In self-perception, you believe your tolerance is your personality, not realizing it's a coping strategy. Here's the critical reframe. These are not character traits. They are adaptations. And healing begins not with confrontation, but with witnessing. Witnessing the moment you override yourself. Witnessing the discomfort you rush to soothe. Witnessing the old fear beneath the politeness. This is the beginning of unlearning, not by becoming cruel, but by becoming honest. Healing for deeply kind people is not about hardening. It's about reclaiming choice. Inner child. Reparenting teaches you to offer yourself what was missing. Protection without punishment. Validation without performance. Shadow work invites you to integrate the parts of you that were labeled selfish, difficult, or too much. You practice saying no, not as rebellion, but as truth. You allow discomfort to exist without rushing to erase it. You choose softness with boundaries, not instead of them. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, and now that attention turns inward. You are not broken. You were trained, and what was trained can be unlearned. Your kindness was never the problem. The absence of self-protection was. You don't need to become less kind to stop tolerating disrespect. You need to become whole enough to include yourself in that kindness." If this resonated, share it with someone who gives too much. Subscribe, not to be fixed, but to remember. Because healing is not about becoming someone else. It's about finally becoming present in your own life.